Hey, 3100. It is Saturday over here, and I didn't really feel like doing the full makeup treatment today. So you're getting me no filter, no makeup. It's okay. I think it'll be okay. So today we're covering nostalgia, which I think pertains to many of your projects. Nostalgia, very simply defined, is the bittersweet longing for another time with the knowledge that you cannot return, that there is no way back. Those are the two parts of nostalgia that make it bittersweet. And many of you in your midterms and proposal have laid claims about capitalizing on consumers' nostalgia for old media in order to resuscitate them as new ones. There have been projects on revitalizing typewriters, a lot of Polaroid projects, projects revitalizing reel to reel. So there are a whole number of you who are engaging in nostalgia in some way, shape, or form, and this week might be really useful to you in terms of solidifying and cohering some of those ideas to kind of fuel the argument that you're going to make for the final. So we're going to look more closely today at nostalgia, what it is, and how people have theorized it over time. So the idea of nostalgia is quite old. The term was coined in the late 17th century to describe Swiss soldiers' mental illness when they were at the front. Sorry if there's background noise. My dog is avidly pulling apart one of his toys. So, yeah. Too bad for the toy. So it tried to account for the soldiers' melancholy and their depression, but it was also a really early term to describe what we now know as PTSD. So PTSD and depression were not really conceived of in the same way back then. They didn't exist in the way that we understand them today. So people had these different medical terms to refer to the same symptoms, and nostalgia was one of them. There were also some theorists that associated nostalgia with trauma, again with PTSD and people's processing of sort of trauma. So this whole kind of like the medical history of this sort of phenomenon sort of harkens back to what we were talking about when we were covering hysteria and women and photography, and how hysteria was sort of term that was misplaced to sort of describe depression and epilepsy and a variety of other illnesses that women had. Were all kind of housed under this term of hysteria because that was the social understanding of women and their sort of mental weakness. So, again, if you're interested in the sort of history of medical science, there's a really interesting history about the how we redefine mental illness with each kind of era, and it sort of evolves from era to era, and that sort of is interlocked with our understandings of society and gender, politics. A little bit of a tangent, but nostalgia was, first closely associated with PTSD and with trauma. Some theorists think that when an entire culture experiences collective trauma, like a war or a genocide, nostalgia is the kind of balm or salve that covers up the damaging aspects of the past and allows people to kind of move forward by forgetting or kind of casting a different tone on what happened to them. These theories are rooted in Freudian notions of repressed memories, that if something happens to you that is really traumatic, people tend to repress that memory and then experience other symptoms, PTSD symptoms, because of the repression. So one sort of less literal example of sort of people who've experienced collective trauma and use nostalgia to kind of cast a rose-tinted image of the things that happened in the past is my 98-year-old Nana, who is still going strong and is sharper than ever. And she talks about the Great Depression in nostalgic terms. And she says, oh, it was a really good time when neighbors were very, closely bonded. And if one neighbor baked a loaf of bread, they would share it with everyone and everyone would share their food. And so she only kind of remembers the good parts of the Great Depression. She doesn't quite, she might be repressing the more sort of the terrible parts of the Great Depression. She also, I'm talking about my Nana here, but it's a good example. She also sort of had tuberculosis early on when she was 12, and she was put in a tuberculosis clinic for 2 years with a collapsed lung, which is how people handled tuberculosis back then. And she remembers the clinic as being a really happy time for her, of like, oh, I read a lot and there were a lot of activities and everyone was so nice to me. So, these are examples of, one is a collective trauma. Well, they're both kind of collective traumas that these sort of tuberculosis clinics were kind of, came about and housed a huge number of children, a lot of whom died, and the Great Depression. They're two sort of collective society traumas that my grandmother is processing through a nostalgic lens in order to maybe misremember the more damaging parts of these sort of social traumas. At least that's what these theorists would say, what is going on. So different sort of theorists, postmodern theorists like Frederick Jameson, who was writing in the 80s, predominantly, have a different but related take. So Jameson argues that with the rise of new technologies and the conditions of late capitalism, we've slowly erased our culture and history. Therefore, we're not making new culture in history. Therefore, we rely on recreating the past through nostalgia in order to have any culture at all. So all of these theories color nostalgia as regressive, as bad, as indicative of a deterioration of the self and culture. So Jameson continues to argue that nostalgia lifts cultural references from the past and then detaches them from their original contexts and then just kind of plunks them into present-day media. And he calls this historical pastiche. So just this kind of like collage of references to the past that are kind of meaningless, but that we need to do because we don't have anything to replace them. So a good example of these would be the work of films of Quentin Tarantino, which heavily rely on nostalgia and aesthetics from the past. And you might argue that Tarantino just borrows from the past because he likes its surface appeal and he's not concerned with the historical context of the past at all. So references to sort of the past in films like Pulp Fiction are very, the references to the 50s don't really have anything that are not really related to the story at all. They're sort of just there for aesthetic kind of interest. Another example is how political rhetoric lifts icons from the past without really paying attention to where they came from. There's a lot of nostalgia at play in the American political campaign at the moment, particularly the Trump campaign, which harkens back to that golden era of the heteronormative married couple with 2.4 children in a little suburban house with a white picket fence and a traditional division of labor, and pies are cooling on windowsills, or the equivalent of that in your culture. I'm sure every culture has a sort of a similar iconic sort of ideal of family from the past that conservative politicians say we should return to. And the odd thing is that exact image of the past didn't really exist, or it existed, but not for everyone. I mean, it didn't exist for Black families. It didn't exist for single moms who were kind of, scraping by. It didn't really apply to urban people or people living in the city. So it's interesting that these sort of really strong images, nostalgic images of the past have such a huge grip and currency in our society, even though they are kind of fantasy to begin with. So you could argue that current political rhetoric lifts images, not even realities, but images out from history without paying attention to things like the civil rights era and the civil rights movement and redlining of suburbs, which describes Black people being barred from buying houses in suburbs, urban lifestyles. It doesn't really pay any attention to queer cultures that were fighting for recognition, or the birth of second wave feminism. It's very sanitized. It's a sanitized version of the past that is really rooted in early American sitcoms of the 1950s, like the Donna Reed Show and the Andy Griffith Show, and I Love Lucy to an extent. So it only wants to pay particular attention to a particular image and to isolate it from history as an ideal. And Jameson would say that this is because we have no new ideas and no new visual languages, so we need to borrow from the past in order to make up for that vacuum at the moment. Another example might be, another example of a Jamesonian sort of idea of nostalgia might be the rockabilly movement, which, it's a bit earlier than your time, but it was a sort of aesthetics of women's fashion from around 10 years ago. And women were borrowing heavily from the 1950s in terms of makeup, hairstyles, and dress. And Jameson would say that this is because we are out of fashion ideas and our culture is corroded to the point where there are no new ideas, especially in a digital era of copying and pasting, where, all we need do is just sort of copy and paste media in order to make our own, and there's nothing really original. And in my first year class, I banned stock photography in all of their projects, and people really struggle. Students really struggle to create new media at first. That's because people are so used to being in a culture where there's this very kind of adroit copying and pasting and borrowing and pastiche from sort of different sources in order to create something new, but Jameson would say it's not really original. So he would argue with the rockabilly sort of movement that this creates a very flat, superficial world full of references to the past, but without meaning. There is a different way of thinking about nostalgia, however, and it's perhaps one that is a little less damning and a little less negative. And there's a way of thinking about nostalgia as a way that we process historical memory and the past in order to move forward. And honestly speaking, that is more my kind of opinion of nostalgia. But you can kind of take from this what you will. You might really kind of be on the Jameson train. So Svetlana Boym distinguishes between two kinds of nostalgia, restorative and reflective. And both are interpreted as valid forms of memory. So while restorative nostalgia longs to rebuild the home that is lost, reflective nostalgia suggests a flexibility and meditation on history, the presence, and the passage of time, rather than the recovery of a perceived truth. So reflective nostalgia can be ironic, it can be humorous, inconclusive, and fragmentary. She writes, the past is not made in the image of the present or seen as foreboding of some present disaster. Rather, the past opens up a multitude of potentialities, non-teleological possibilities of historical development. So non-teleological means that we don't think of history as linear, as this happened, and then this happened, and this happened, and this happened. It's a constant kind of progress of, we're always kind of trending upwards. But this term says that history is more of a path of stops and starts and steps backwards and forwards and loops, and history might regress for a while, then progress. So progress is not a straightforward, easy path of accrual and success. In other words, nostalgia can show the stops and starts, cycles and tangents of history. And Boehm talks about the immigrant shrine as an important part of nostalgia and the process of assimilation into a new culture. So by immigrant shrine, she means that kind of cabinet or little nook or shelf in your grandmother or mother's house, especially if you're first generation Australian, that is all about the old culture and is all taken from the old culture. And it's this little place in the home that is sort of designated for remembering the old culture and reminding us of where we came from, not necessarily regressively longing to recreate that past, because you clearly moved and sort of immigrated here, but it's integrating the past into the process of assimilation. So I would further argue that nostalgia is bound up with the media technology we use to recreate it. In other words, nostalgia is only as good as its representation through media, and we must think about the capacities of new media that allow us to use different forms of nostalgia. For example, Facebook Memories is a media-informed nostalgic experience. It entirely depends on the repository of images that you've put on Facebook and the system of curating images from a certain amount of years ago. So this is an example of how media and nostalgia are very closely interlinked, and the sort of media capacities inform the nostalgic experience you have. Sometimes our depictions of the past actually help us navigate big moments of media transition in the present. So I make the argument that the show Mad Men figures media technologies prominently in its story world, and more importantly, it concentrates on how its characters greet these new media technologies of their time as a kind of template for how we might also be creating new media of our time. So there's like a couple episodes in Mad Men where the ad agency installs a computer in one of the rooms, and at this stage, computers were these huge machines that took up a whole room, and came with a kind of usually a female sort of a technician who was in charge of, who knew females were among the first programmers, right? And the episodes really kind of focus on different people's reactions to the computer coming in to the agency. Like, some people are excited about it, some people are really unsure about it, some people are very hostile about it. And so these episodes kind of, I argue, are sort of templates or kind of ways that we process, oh, what are the new media technologies happening around our time that are provoking similar kind of reactions from people. So I think nostalgia can be a way of drawing connections across history that could be, healing, potentially. I also make the case for something I call nostalgic anticipation. That is when we take a photo or capture an experience on media, we are all the while anticipating that photo or film or what have you as having nostalgic currency in the future. So we might project ourselves looking back at the photo when we take it. So when you're taking a photo of your friends having some sort of amazing experience or adventure, as you're taking the photo, you're also processing, how am I going to look back on this photo in the future? And what kind of meaning will it have for me? It's probably going to be, I am capturing a future nostalgic moment. And that affects how we kind of capture that moment in the present, right? Nostalgia can be critical as well. It doesn't have to adopt the past full sail as something ideal. So also in Mad Men and other sort of TV shows that recreate the past, like Masters of Sex, other sort of, historical, The Crown, other sort of historical television shows. Things like the sexism and racism of the past are highly scrutinized in the show. In the same breath that the series recreates the past nostalgically, it also shows, these are opportunities to show the less desirable traits of the past. And you can go farther to argue that nostalgia depends on the understanding that the past is lost and can't be returned to. So, there's some people who think of nostalgia as regressive because it's just indicative of people who want to go back to the past, right? And then you can also argue that nostalgia is experienced by people who know full well they can't go back to the past, but they're looking to the past for pointers in order to proceed to the future. So nostalgia is therefore a social processing of that understanding that you can't go back to the past, that perhaps even that the past was not as golden as it would seem, and that we don't want to necessarily recreate it. So in a nutshell, my argument is that we can use nostalgic media to negotiate history and change it in the present. And I'll leave you with that, and we'll come back to some case studies in the next video. Hi, and we're back. So just a few case